Welcome to Clothing Culture. I'm Emily Lane.
I'm Brett Schnitker.
We speak with experts where we explore the global dynamics that shape trends in the fashion industry.
Brought to you by Stars Design Group, a global production and design house with over 30 years of industry experience.
Welcome back to another episode of Clothing Culture. Today, we are going to be talking about responsible production and manufacturing in a turbulent world. Welcome back, Brett.
Hi, Emily.
And wow, what a topic. Turbulent world, responsible production. Let's start at what does responsible really mean?
Yeah.
Because I think we understand what turbulent world perhaps means.
I remember my parents saying when I went out, on a date, be responsible, but that's not what this means. I think, that term has changed in the industry for a really, over many years. It used to be responsibly find a manufacturer that could give you a quality product at a good price on time. But today it means, so much more than that. It focuses on the welfare of the workers. I think, the world talks about sustainability a lot, but part of that sustainability is the human chain too, right?
Mm-hmm.
The humans that are manufacturing product. And, there's a lot of economies that live and thrive on apparel as part of, their GDP, and workers' rights are more and more important. And I think, we've heard these devastating stories around the world of people that have not taken care of their workers or been very irresponsible with places that they put workers. And it's really hurt overall economies and people. These can be our brothers and sisters. They can be family members. I've traveled the world. I've been in over 70 countries. And, these people just want to feed their families. They want to, they have similar hopes and dreams as many of us do. And I think it's important that we show them that we care too,
How do you go about vetting whether or not a manufacturing partner is truly being, good to the workers and really cares about worker welfare?
It's definitely not an overnight decision for us. I think it comes to developing a relationship, understanding the mentality behind ownership or management of a particular factory and what they find important. That's really most and foremost in our minds when we sit down and think about factory relationships. One of the other ways to do it, a powerful way to do it also, is certifications. There are organizations that are out there that help those that don't have time or ability to develop, direct relationships with a number of factories to help understand where they sit on workers' welfare and workers' rights. RAP, BSCI, Better Work are some of those different organizations, and they have, in many cases, pretty stringent requirements on managing, the different workers' rights around the world.
Is that an expensive process for people to go through?
Yeah, I think that probably therein lies some of the challenge on a global scale, because it is a time-consuming, expensive process for a lot of factories to go through those certifications. And much like in the United States, we talked about in the last episode about boutique brands, right? A lot of boutique brands won't buy the mass quantities that these larger factories produce that can afford the certification and, all those different details. There's also boutique manufacturing, on that side of the coin. And they're generally family run, small organizations, 1-2 lines, sometimes 4. And, they find it difficult to put all those steps in place. And I think that's where it goes back to really having a transparent relationship with both the ownership and dialoguing with factory workers and understanding where they are with laws and certifications and doing some some detailed research to make sure that they are being compliant, they do care.
You've often spoken about how the apparel manufacturing in various countries it plays a key role in the industrialization and of a country, and it being able to play on a global economic field. When thinking about that and thinking culturally and socially and just overall economics from one country to another, and looking at these various certifications that come into play to measure worker welfare, is it all looked at through the same lens?
That's an interesting question. We live in a pretty diverse world, and each country has set up its own laws and regulations to manage worker welfare. And certainly, some countries are a lot more advanced in terms of workers' welfare and rights, and some countries are probably more repressive. So, the first part of looking and vetting a factory is, does it meet the laws of the land effectively? And in most of the countries I've been to, there's some pretty good information on that. However, the next step you have to do is look at the laws of the land. Are the laws of the land fair and equitable in your view? And that's where some of these certifications come into play, because they're generated sort of outside of the laws of the land and set, really good standards for worker welfare. And so, again, I don't think that the solution is one or the other. I think it's a combination of those different things. It's developing relationships with partners that care. And it's self-awareness of nations, because, again, we live in this super connected world. All the news shows up on our phone immediately. And if something goes wrong at a particular factory in a particular country, the ramifications for the economy are immense. There was a situation with Rana Plaza in Bangladesh years ago. It was a tragic situation where the building collapsed and many people were killed. Tragic enough that happened.
Right.
But on a more global scale, Bangladesh relies on apparel manufacturing heavily in terms of making sure that their people are fed and roofs over their heads and everything else. And, I have a small soapbox about Bangladesh, but when that occurred, there was certainly an uproar about the individual, as there certainly should be. But instead of a global community, a global economic community, partnering together to say, look, we have this economic power and strength, you rely on the apparel manufacturing as a whole, we're going to use that leverage to ensure that workers' rights are improved. Many companies ran from Bangladesh. They were like, man, that's a problem spot. I'm not going to deal with those headaches. And so the impact to the economy and other workers because of that Rana Plaza situation was pretty profound. And, there's still production in Bangladesh, but I can tell you that at one point, the country itself, and I think workers in general, suffered from lack of production in the country. And I think there's more effective ways for us to understand that economic leverage, that business can have a lot of profound impact on improving workers' lives and rights. We got to engage and get a little messy, but I think it's important.
There is certainly impact and a domino effect to certain decisions, and we've seen a lot of that in this last year. COVID came into play. A lot of people started canceling orders. Help walk us through kind of the impact of some of these rash decisions.
Yeah, I think initially what we're seeing in many companies that we're dealing with is that demand exceeds supply today. It's human nature to panic, and especially in a situation that's unknown. It's not like we live through a pandemic every few years. This is a brand new situation. So, I understand the emotion and the decision in what occurred, self-preservation issues, company preservation issues, et cetera. But the ramifications going worldwide have been epic, proportionally tragic. I mean, there have been companies that good, upstanding companies that employ a lot of workers that really have gone out of business because these massive cancellations, they leverage their credit to supply these large American corporations or European corporations, et cetera. And when cancellations occur, they've got nowhere to go. And so,
And they're also stuck with that bill, right? Because in many of
well,
these
to
cases,
wherever they are
they've-
along the production cycle,
right,
right?
they've already paid to have,
Right,
fabrics and
right.
trims and workers and
Yeah,
bring
for sure.
projects along. So,
Absolutely. So I think, we all talk partnership. We all talk about, global equity and everything. I think that comes into, there are probably different ways to have accomplished those situations along that pipeline. Preserving the fabric, slowing production, working out requirements in a better way than in some cases occurred internationally.
Yeah, I think not making a quick decision and thinking through what can be done to preserve what's in place,
Yeah.
and again that domino effect. Thinking about all of those people who have lost their jobs in these cities that are now economically deprived because people are not working,
Right.
and as you mentioned, demand is still there.
Yeah.
So, what can be done as far as creating a good strategy for, balanced production in today's world? And
Yeah.
what does really balanced production mean?
Yeah, so you're right. What does it mean? It's a complicated question. And it changes based upon each brand or company's individual product mix, right?
Okay.
So, but a good strategy is making sure that you're not country specific. This last year has had a lot of interesting things for our industry. Our industry's never been boring. I mean, there's always been something that's made for challenge and kept us up nights. But I think, with the advent of tariffs that were a miserable disaster.
Right.
but
Constantly changing.
Constantly
evolving, yeah.
changing. I think, we had to be creative. Certainly, China had built a powerhouse of apparel manufacturing, and there are specific industries like shoes that were so heavily concentrated in China. And so, those costs either get passed along to the consumer, or production has to move to various areas that tariffs don't exist. And the economy and the industrialization and the infrastructure has to be there
Right.
for that business to move. I mean, China disproportionately ships a much larger percentage of apparel and footwear and stuff to the U.S. than other nations. And so managing that supply chain, I think, is interesting today. And COVID plays another role. You layer on this pandemic that's going on, and certain countries are harder hit by it. Certain countries managed to escape a number of things with good leadership. Taiwan, for instance, has very few cases of COVID. They just don't have a ton of apparel production anymore. They used to be a very large apparel producing nation, but they are doing, still doing some fabrication and other things. And so, understanding the different nuances of each nation and what each nation excels at or is not so good at is important as a starting point. But then understanding the balance of your assortment between these different nations that are occurring. It's a constant balancing game, and you've got to know these countries. You've got to know the nuances of production in each country that does production.
So much to sort through. I mean, you really have to be globally curious.
I think not only curious, you have to be involved globally. You have to be engaged on an international level. I think that in conversations we've had with a number of brands and customers, they don't travel like they used to.
Well, it's expensive. It's time
certainly
consuming.
that sometimes it's scary, or
Yeah.
there's different areas. But this is certainly a sector of business that relies on global production, and I think you have to be very open and engaged, real time, on the ground whether it's you or offices or partnerships or whatever in these various countries to make sure that you're balancing all of these things that we've talked about: worker welfare, quality, reliability, production, affordability, all those things.
What are some other factors at play that have their hand in, kind of change of the economics of things or impacting decisions and for locations of sourcing?
A lot of those things have been around with us for years. We always are managing labor costs, political situations in countries, focus of country governments on what sectors they're investing in. For years, we really felt China's apparel production, not the textile part, the manufacturing of fabric, but the garment, cut, make, and sew kind of portions, factories. We really thought that those were going to end. They had, China had migrated and moved, as many nations do, to more advanced manufacturing.
Right.
That
Technology,
pay,
right?
technologies, appliances. They're able to garner more per hour income, so then workers benefit. And so we really felt China was going to abdicate from that. So there was this strategy in place to look toward countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, Indonesia. Certainly Africa has played an important, interesting role in, the future of apparel production. I started in Africa in 2000, kind of worked my way north. And there is opportunity, but the infrastructure challenges there are still pretty great.
What are, you've talked a little bit, you've said Ethiopia, Vietnam, China. What are some some strengths of certain countries that you've seen?
I think different countries exhibit different strengths, certainly. I think, when you look at India, I've been in India 30 years, and I find them to be extremely entrepreneurial. You give them a project, you give them a task, they really want to figure out a new solution for that. I think, that comes with the society as a whole. They tend to be entrepreneurial as a society. I think that, other countries like Ethiopia, they have a interesting shift from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy very early, but there's an eagerness and a skill set in those workers that can produce some pretty good product there, and combined with a pretty affordable monthly wage, there's a good value which offsets some of the challenges in the country. We always look at SWOT analysis by country. Long lead times out of Ethiopia are just kind of a reality. And so, you, based upon individual mixes, you can look toward a number of different countries for strengths and weaknesses and understanding those. But those are a few countries that I've mentioned that lay it out.
Are there any other kind of factors or global challenges that you see that are having an impact on the entire supply chain right now?
Interesting question. I think, as we mentioned in the last podcast, we talked about this kind of growth and advent of boutique brands. I think changing factory infrastructures internationally to recognize and be able to serve these boutique brands with smaller quantities, quicker turn, I think is a unique challenge because there's more and more every day. And I think some of these large, massive brands, and certainly brick and mortar, are really trying to find their way and are struggling.
Yeah.
So as there's this shift to this kind of more entrepreneurial, more and smaller kind of focus, I think that's going to be an interesting thing for manufacturing overseas to sort of get their hands around.
Do you see anywhere that's doing that right?
I think there are countries that can manage it better than others. I think certain countries, again, like India, in smaller shops, they can manage smaller quantity. But you have to make sure you're vetting those smaller shops to make sure that the workers' welfare and everything is there. But I think countries that have a variety of factory sizes can help to do that. Factories that are perhaps more experienced with European production. In a lot of cases, European brands buy less quantity than some of the giants, Zara excluded for sure, and H&M. But I think, there are a lot of those factories that kind of are in this orbit of these smaller brands that understand that. And I think places like Turkey have some good manufacturing capabilities. We were on a government trade mission to El Salvador,
Right.
and I think there's some opportunity for a country like El Salvador with smaller factory bases and proximity to the U.S. to play a strategic role in kind of this evolution of brands in the U.S.
There is so much to consider in this space. Do you have any other kind of final thoughts to share in today's conversation?
I think manufacturing and sourcing is not an easy process. And I think partnering with a reliable manufacturing source, someone that's embraced the world over a number of years, is really important. And again, as we deal and we talk about transparency and so much of this stuff, really understanding the transparency in the supply chain is equally important.
Well, thank you. That is a great tie-in to episode 3, where we talk about vetting factory partners. Make sure you check it out and subscribe so you don't miss any of these insightful conversations.
Thanks, Emily.